Hey, it is Zennial Gamer, and today we're going to be talking about game progression. So we're actually going to be breaking this video down into 5 segments: early game, early mid, mid-mid, late mid, and late game, or end game as you prefer to call it. So I have never done chapter segments before. I'm going to try to do them when I upload the video. That's the intention here. If I fail with that because I don't know exactly how to do it, I'll put time markers in the description down below. So one or the other. This is how I would see most people progressing through the different phases of the game and kind of the different benchmarks you'll be looking for. Now, there are going to be certain things that some people may be able to accomplish earlier or may not be able to accomplish until later than others, just based a little bit on luck or really generally what you care about. So for example, you can see on number 8 on the early game list right here says clear TOA N70. Maybe you pull a Varad really early on and clearing TOA is no big deal. Or maybe you don't pull any AoE control monsters and clearing TOA is a really big deal. So it doesn't necessarily have to be exactly at that stage of game, but it's just kind of a general guideline. So with that said, let's talk first about early game. Now, obviously, when you start the game, the first thing you're going to do is just start to build your monsters, level them up, 5-star and then ultimately 6-star them. And if you follow the game quest, that's going to give you a really big kind of guide point on how you should be progressing and doing those things. Now, your ultimate goal as a starting player is to build towards a GB12 team. You're not going to build the GB12 team on day 1 or even, unless you're Sean B, day 10. It's going to take some time, but you should be building towards that team. So to that end, you're going to be building, a team that can pass GB1, GB2, GB3, you progress all the way through. As you're going through those dungeons, you should start building up a rune stockpile. Now, this is a good point for me to mention. I'm going to be covering a lot of different content in this particular video, so I'm going to not really get into great detail on almost any of it. But there is one thing I want to talk a little bit in detail about, which is going to be rune and artifact stockpiling. So we'll talk about artifacts when we get there. But for right now, as far as the runes go, my strong recommendation to everybody is that you should save 600 runes. Now, don't save like the garbage runes, like the white 4-star runes that you're getting from scenarios. But the first 600 runes you get that have any potential whatsoever, save them. So 5-star, I'd say look for 5-star and above, look for blue and above. They should have at least one substat that could be useful. And then that way when you roll it, that substat can improve. And the first 600 runes, remember we've got 800 slots in our inventory. The first 600 runes you get that could be even remotely useful, hang on to them. From that point, your goal should be to bring every one of those runes to +6 because it is relatively inexpensive. And that's going to give you a lot more information because it's going to tell you what substats those runes hit. Now, as you're enchanting them, when it hits +3 and +6, the question you want to ask yourself with every rune is, can this rune still be useful? If the answer is yes, it can still be useful, keep it till it hits +6. Once you have 600 runes, which may happen in early game, it may happen in early mid or mid, probably it's got to be an early game or early mid. It's got to be one of those two. But depending upon how fast you progress and if you're free to play or not, maybe it takes a little bit longer. But once you have 600 runes, then every time you get a rune, you're going to ask yourself a simple question. Is this rune, or can this rune be, better than the worst rune in my inventory right now? Can this rune be better than rune number 600 in my inventory? If the answer is yes, keep it and enchant it to +3. Ask the question again. Then enchant it to +6 and ask that question again. If the rune stays better, keep it, and then when you do a rune cleanup later on, you'll sell the rune that has become your worst rune and keep the new rune. That is how you progressively improve your rune stockpile. And of course, whenever you build and rune a new monster, that leaves some fewer runes in inventory. So you'll go ahead and farm out some new runes and get back to your 600. Now you're going to start building your rune stockpile from day 1, but let's be realistic. You're not really going to have very many usable runes until you're not going to be getting many usable runes from dungeons until you get at least probably to Giants B8 or B9. And then the runes will start to progressively get a little bit better, and that stockpile will continue to improve, and you'll sell the worst ones. And remember, at all times, you want to try and make sure that every rune in your inventory is at least +6. Later on in the game, as you can afford it, as you're farming out mana, you're going to want to get those runes all in your inventory to +9, and then the long-term goal is to have them all to +12. It's really important to know how a rune's going to turn out when you're trying to find the best builds for your monsters. But that is jumping a step ahead. That +12 is not going to happen until much later in the game. The +9 is probably not going to happen until that much later either. But +6, honestly, you should be able to start working towards that goal right away from early game. Now, also in early game, you should be starting World Boss. To use a monster in World Boss, it needs to be, if I remember correctly, I think it's at least level 30. Now, it doesn't matter how many stars it is, so you could use a 4-star level 30, 5-star level 30, or it might have been level 35. I honestly don't remember, but I do know that it doesn't have to be 6-star to be usable in World Boss, but I know if you do 6-star it and then it's below that level, it cannot be used in World Boss until it reaches that level. So World Boss is pretty inexpensive. It's 30 energy a day. Usually I like to use that energy right before I go to bed, so it helps drain my energy quicker. And you do get some, decent mana rewards, if nothing else, which is really helpful in early game. And then you always have the chance of popping a Light Dark Scroll, Legendary Scroll, Devilmon. They're really rare. I mean, you'll get one of those great things like every 3 to 6 months, but still, if you started early on, you still get more of them. And on top of that, World Boss is going to give you a lot of essence. And in early game, it's really helpful to get that essence to awaken monsters. Now, you should not stress that, not build monsters for World Boss in early game, or honestly even in mid game. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But you should use the monsters you have just to throw up a score in World Boss. It's never been easier. Now that we've got artifacts, the scores in World Boss are super easy to achieve. Obviously, you're not going to get triple S on day 1, but whatever score you get on day 1 is probably going to be much higher than what people were getting on day 1 a year ago. Now, in addition to World Boss, in early game, you are going to want to build your first arena offense. And guess what? It's going to suck. You're going to lose a lot, and that is okay. What you really want to do at that stage of the game, the single thing that you're going to accomplish out of this, or 2 things you're going to accomplish. One is you're just going to start to get used to arena a little bit. You're going to learn Summoner's War PvP. The second thing, and much more important, is you're going to start building up your towers, because the towers take a very, very long time. Even with the things they've done to accelerate it, they take a very, very long time to max, but they make a huge difference. And it doesn't just have to be max towers. It's much, much less expensive to take towers to level 5 than level 10 because the costs get progressively higher. Get all your towers to level 5, you're getting half the benefits for a quarter of the cost. And that's something that's very achievable in the first handful of months, depending on how active you are, maybe 6 to 9 months, but definitely something you could get all your towers to level 5 in those first 6 to 9 months of play. So the earlier you start on it, the earlier you're going to be able to accomplish that. You also want to start considering which monsters you would 2A. Now, you're not going to be able to do level 5, obviously. In the 2A, you might not even be able to do level 4, and if we're talking like super early game, hell, you might be stuck on level 1 or 2. That's all right. You're still progressing yourself through the game, so you do whatever level you can do without getting fails, but the important thing is Dimensional Hole energy is extremely limited. It's going to accrue at a rate of about 12 per day, so you want to use at least 12 energy per day so you're always earning that energy back. The earlier in the game you start, the bigger leg up you're going to have as your account grows, because you'll have more monsters to aid and possibly even skilled up if you've started right from day 1. Now, you're also going to want to, at some point, start building some low-level artifact teams. Doesn't honestly even have to be a full auto team. Doesn't have to be level 10. Just something that can work in the dungeon. So I said there were 2 things we're going to talk about in depth, right? Runes and artifacts. So here's the spiel on the artifacts. While it is really nice to get legend or hero artifacts, it is totally unnecessary at early and mid-game levels. So unless you're using these artifacts for late game PvP or at least late mid-game PvP, it doesn't really matter if you get the perfect mix of substats. It doesn't really matter if you get lots of extra rolls. The single biggest benefit that you're probably getting from artifacts, honestly, is the bonus stats. So you get an attack artifact, and you get it with attack bonus, and you put it on a dungeon monster, and that's an extra 58 attack at level 12. Or as your mana improves, it's an extra 100 attack at level 15, and that is very significant because you can get 2 artifacts. It's an extra 200 attack. If you happen to get, and I don't care if it's a green artifact from a low dungeon, you get a green artifact that had a min roll crit damage on skill 3, and you min roll it again, so that's +3 and +3, that's an extra 6% crit damage. So the thing with artifacts is that there's far, far less difference from a green artifact to a legend artifact than there is from a green rune to a legend rune. Now, like runes, artifacts can roll good or bad. They can roll with crap, and they can also roll amazing. So granted, if you were to happen to drop a legend artifact and quad roll crit damage, and it was all max rolls, then that would be pretty significant. But I don't know what the math is, but off the top of my head, I'm going to say the odds of that are probably about equal to being hit by lightning. It's so much more unlikely even than it is to quad roll speed. You've got a bigger range on your roll. It's between 3 and 6 on crit damage. The crit, and then just the number of different substats that can drop on an artifact. It's going to be so much more rare to drop an artifact that even has crit damage on the right skill than the bigger range and everything else. So it's going to be virtually impossible. So the point I want to make here is that doing low-level artifact dungeons is totally fine when you're trying to build up your PvE teams. If you're trying to build up dungeon teams, jump into a low-level dungeon, farm for a couple of hours or however long it takes to get a handful of artifacts that have an attack-based stat, and maybe have a good substat. Maybe that substat hits a roll, maybe not. Doesn't really matter all that much. Just benefit from those free stats. You can work on building artifact dungeon teams and farming artifacts later on. Now, also during early game, you're going to begin your TOA, Trial of Ascension. Your goal should be to reach level 70 on TOA as quickly as you can, but without obsessing over it. So I'll tell you guys, it was actually TOA-H for myself, but I got stuck on one level and I obsessed on it for days. I burnt hundreds, maybe thousands of energy. I 6-starred like 4 monsters. I did finally pass the level, but it was silly and it wasn't worth it. I wasted several days, I'm not even exaggerating, so many hours, so much energy on this one level for no prize. And I don't think I even managed to beat TOA 70 on that rotation. I think I got stuck 2 levels later. And then the next month, that level wound up being super easy for me, or I guess 2 months later when we got back to that tower, it was super easy for me because by then my game progression had gotten to the point where I should be able to beat that level. So you want to go as far as you can, but you don't want to just get obsessed and get stuck and sit on one level forever. Your goal should be, and during early game, your goal should be to clear TOA normal 70 because that's the Devilmon. It's the single most valuable commodity in this game. Nothing is more valuable than a Devilmon. Don't waste them and get every one that you can. You're also going to start TOA hard. You're most likely not going to reach level 70. The goal is going to be to get to 70, but that's probably going to happen later on in the game. Now, for me personally, the graduation from early game is probably about the point that you complete your GB12 team. Not speed team, just the team that can auto GB12. If it takes 4 minutes, so be it. So here's my opinion. If you can beat GB12, even if you're failing a lot, even if you're super slow, you should be on GB12. I don't care if you have a 20-second GB10 team and a 4-minute GB12 team, you should be on GB12. Here's why. First of all, the drop rates are so far beyond ridiculous. Like before the dungeons came in, I was telling people, if you can't do 12, stick on 10, But now that I've actually farmed these dungeons for a couple of weeks, the drop rates are just beyond ridiculous. Like almost every single run, it feels like I'm getting a rune that I could test and scribe. My mana can't even keep up with it. My standards have gone up. It's crazy. Here's the thing. I don't know the exact rates, but I think on GB10, you're probably only dropping a 6-star rune once every 10 or 20 runs. So if you're now dropping a 6-star rune every run on GB12 and legend rate is 1.5 times, then it's actually 15 to 30 times more often that you're getting a legend rune, or at least that you're getting a legend 6-star rune. That's nuts. 15 to 30 times, or I mean, whatever the number is, but you guys get the idea. Every rune that drops a 6-star, so every time you would see a legend 5-star in GB10, which is much more often, that's now a legend 6-star. So even if you're failing some in GB12, in the end, you're going to wind up getting far better runes far faster by farming that higher level dungeon. Now here's another thing, the crystal burn. If you're doing 4-minute runs, you're not recharging that many crystals. Whereas if you're doing 20-second runs, you're recharging 60 to 90 crystals an hour or more. So you move to GB12, you spend less than half or less than a third or less than a quarter of the crystals, depending on how slow your team is, while getting better runes. The value is simply there. And then from there, I would recommend you go straight to NB12. Now you guys are probably saying, where's DB12? So here's the thing with that. Dragon's B12 is now a harder dungeon. I think for everybody at every stage of game, Dragon's B12 is a more difficult dungeon and it is a slower dungeon. But particularly for early game players, the value of the runes it drops is lower than those that you're going to get from Necro from a progression standpoint as well. Violent runes are absolutely useful in the dungeons, like I'm running in the background. Several of these monsters are on violent because it gives you a chance to make better top scores and it gives you some dirt protection. But when we talk about building our initial stable teams, there are certain stat thresholds that really matter. And if you're in early game and you're not raiding yet, reaching those stat thresholds is much easier in Fatal or Rage runes than it is in Violent runes. On top of that, with the newer dungeons, a lot of monsters, we're actually building them on triple will now. And so the will runes are also going to have a lot of value. And then lastly, Necro is simply a faster dungeon now. It's faster and easier than Dragons. It may not necessarily be easier to build your first team in early game. Necro and Dragons are both going to be difficult teams to build in early game depending on which monsters you've summoned. But once the team is built, the team runs faster. It drops more runes that are going to have more value in terms of dungeon PvE game progression. And you get more mana per run. And the mana depression is real, guys. We're all hurting on mana. You may wind up having to go through, but I can't remember. You may wind up having to go through and manual that dungeon one time to unlock Necro. But as far as building your team and setting up your focus, I strongly encourage people at this point right now to go from GB12 to NB12. So whether Necro's B12 is the graduation from early game or the start of early mid game, I happen to put it on the early game graphic, but that's basically once you start farming Necro B12, that's the point where you move into early mid game. Now there's one other big advantage of Necro B12, which is obviously that Rage and Will runes are what you're going to need for BJR5. Now you're not going to be building BJR5 at early mid game, but those runes that you're accruing or accumulating now that are going into your rune stockpile that you're building up, those are the runes you're going to be using later on. So for early mid-game, at this point, by the way, I should mention that you're continuing to 6-star monsters all the way throughout the game. So I didn't put it on every single graphic, but 6-starring monsters is just a continual part of the game. And I also want to mention that when you're 6-starring monsters, only 6-star the ones that you can rune and use. When we just talk about resource allocation, 6-starring like 50 monsters and then putting garbage runes on 30 of them doesn't really help because you're never going to want to use them, and all of those garbage rune sets will suck out good runes. So imagine you've got your 50th worst monster and he's got 5 utter garbage runes, which means he's too weak to use anywhere, and then he's got one amazing rune that you forget is on him, and that amazing rune doesn't go on a good monster because it's on your garbage monster that you never look at. So basically just 6-star the number of monsters that you can rune and use, and then continue to 6-star throughout the game. Now the reason I mention that right now is because part of early mid-game is going to be building your Rift teams, building your Homunculi, and then starting on the Dimensional Predator. So for the Rift teams, you're going to wind up needing quite a few new monsters, probably unless you've built twins for your dungeons. If you got lucky and summoned twins early, then you may need a lot fewer monsters for your Rift teams. But if you don't have twins, then you're probably going to have to 6-star some new monsters for your Rift teams. Start building your Homunculi really as soon as you can probably do B or A, somewhere in there, B or A on the Rifts. I personally did my Rifts at C's and D's when the Homunculus cost 3 times as much to build as well, and it was totally worth it. They are some of the most powerful and useful monsters in the game, and getting them early game is going to help advance your progression a lot. Now, Dimensional Predator, on the other hand, really isn't going to do all that much for progression. I know a lot of people got very frustrated with him this first month out. The simple reality of it is the runes that you use basically don't matter. You just need to have lots of crit rate, lots of crit damage, and lots of accuracy, and maybe do a little bit of speed tuning. However, the monsters that you use are going to matter a lot. And if you're early or early mid-game, you may not have the monsters to do the Predator content. But if you can't pass it, I mean, honestly, it really doesn't change game progression that much. It's one rune and a couple of grinds once a month. It's a really, really strong rune. I'm not going to lie or minimize it, but it's still just one rune. If you're a newer player, think about all the people who have been here for 5-6 years before. They definitely have much more of a head start on you than one rune. So I wouldn't get too frustrated over Predator, and I would just try it again the next month. Now, also an early mid-game is about the time that you should start considering, or that you should start guild content PvP. You should probably be in a Conqueror guild, C1, 2, 3, somewhere in there, low Conqueror guild. Basically just starting to learn PvP, learn how it works, start to get an idea of the different counters. It shouldn't be a focus for you at this point. You shouldn't be investing quality runes or 6-starring monsters for PvP and allowing that to take precedence over your PvE teams. So if your PvE teams are good, then you can make some monsters for PvP, but your priority right now should still be about improving PvE. It's like building the foundation. It's like if you're building a building, basically, right? You lay the foundation first before you build all the floors on top of it. So if you try and jump into PvP before PvE, your building's going to collapse. The foundation of your pathway through this game is building your farming teams, because at the end of the day, it's a farming game. The more you farm, the better your runes and rune quality are going to be. You are also going to want to build your first raid teams. And yes, that says R3+ on the graphic. I mentioned this in a video once before. I don't care if you guys start on R3. I don't care if you farm R3 for a week. I farmed R3 for a month. No joke. I legitimately farmed it several hours a day for a month. The majority of what you get in R3 is going to be blues. Most players, even up through late game, will keep blues and continue to grind and regrind their runes to get +6s, and then we save the legends for the premium runes. And obviously, in R5 you get a lot more heroes, a lot more purples, and you'll continue to grind and regrind with those as well. But like for me personally, I've got, I think, 1,700 runes. Not every single rune has +7 on it. A lot of them I'm very happy with +6, so I keep using the blues. The main reason you're doing R3 is to build your first R5 team, or actually to build R4 and then to build R5. I guarantee you that you will get to R5 many, many months faster if you start in R3 than if you just try and farm out the perfect runes. Now that statement is not quite as true these days with the amazing drops as it was a month ago, but it's still very true. If you just take even like really bad runes and you grind them with like green and blue grinds, those bad runes will still be better than most legend runes that drop. You add so much to a rune through gems and grinds. Now the other things you're going to be doing in early mid-game, you're going to try and complete TOA normal. For some people this will be much easier than others. It honestly just depends on the monsters that you have summoned, the luck or not luck. But for the most part, TOA normal can be completed with free-to-play monsters with the rune quality that you'll have in early mid-game. And you should now be shooting for TOA hard 70 so that you're getting that Devilmon, that second Devilmon every month. You're also going to try and build your level 5 teams for 2A farming in Dimensional Hole. If you can't get the level 5 teams, level 4 is still fine here. And now it's time to build that DB12 team. Probably still not farming DB12 all that much, but you should have the team built by the time you complete early mid-game. In mid-game, by now you're starting to get slightly higher quality runes. You should be looking to build your first speed teams. In the current dungeons, I would define a speed team as about 1 minute and 30 seconds. Anything that's averaging under 1 minute and 30 seconds is a speed team. A super speed team would be anything averaging a minute. But your first iterations of speed teams, 1 minute 30 is good. That should be your goal. So in mid-game, you're going to be working towards building those speed teams. You're going to be working towards getting triple S and or 5 million scores for the achievement in your rifts. You're going to be working towards completing TOA hard 100. And you're probably going to start to get a little bit more serious about PvP. So you'll look to join like a low Guardian 1 guild. And believe me, there is a huge difference between the bottom 500 Guardian guilds and the top 500, and the difference gets even wider when you get into the top 100 or 200 Guardian 1 guilds. The guilds that are close to G2 versus the guilds that are close to C3, there's a huge gaping chasm. You'll probably also start considering doing some ancient rune farming at this point. You should be building your first teams. I would not do any ancient rune farming if you can't beat level 5. So if you're unable to beat level 5 at this stage of game, that's totally fine. Just keep going through and doing 2As and doing 2A skill ups if you've built all the 2As that you need. Obviously, for example, we're using Rauk in the background. Rauk is one of the most amazing monsters in the game. You can skill him up through fusion. Once you can start rune farming, it's definitely worth doing. I would recommend Alunia as your primary target, but Lumal and Karzhan both have their purposes. You would do Karzhan before your BJR5 team is built, which at this stage of the game, that's about the time you're looking to build your BJR5 team. And then Lumal, you really, honestly, Lumal's just like a tiny bit not as good as Alunia, and it's much easier to beat. So if you can get a stable Lumal team and you can't get a stable Alunia team, then Lumal's fine. If you can get Alunia stable, then I would do that one. So as I said, you're also going to be looking to build a stable, fast R5 team, and then you're going to use that team to farm enough gems and grinds that you are now able to build a BJR5 team. And once you have your BJR5 team built, it is the single biggest leap you will make at any point along your Summoner's War journey. And I'm not exaggerating. Because you can add about 20-25% of the value to every rune, and because even though artifacts now exist, runes are still by far and away the core of this game and the core of the power of your monsters, raiding is ultimately the single biggest advantage that you can give yourself when it comes to building up strength of monsters. And BJR5 allows you to raid so much faster. So when you complete your BJR5 team, it's the single biggest step forward you're probably going to take in this game. You are going to want to start doing some artifact farming, not on scale. You're still going to want to be focusing largely on getting runes and 6-starring monsters and things like that, but you should be starting to build up your artifact stockpile a little bit. For artifact stockpiling, it's going to be the same thing I discussed with runes in the beginning, but just with smaller numbers, because you can only hold 300 artifacts, right? So you should save about 200 artifacts, and then every time you get a new artifact, from there you ask yourself, can this artifact be better than my worst artifact? If the answer is yes, enchant it to +3, ask that question again. If the answer is still yes, take it to +6, ask that question again. If the answer is still yes, then just sit on it, because these things suck up mana like an analogy I'm not going to give in a pre-recorded video. But yeah, these things they take a ton of mana. So +6 is really fine with them. And then as you continue to farm, you'll just keep replacing out those +6s. When you get ready to put it on a monster, then you'll bring it up to +9 or +12. Also during mid game, you're probably going to start to push an arena shooting for C1+. Not everybody is going to make it to C1 at this stage of game, and that's totally fine. It's more about, this is the time when you're thinking about pushing. You're trying to push to C1+. That's the definition of kind of mid game. You might make it, you might not, but it's more about the effort and the focus that you're making. Now, late mid-game players, they're going to tend to move into a higher G1 guild where the PvP and the sieges are more competitive. They're also probably going to start RTA. They may start and stop really quick. RTA is not for everybody, but this is about the time where you'd actually have the chance to win a fight or two in RTA, so you might start RTA. You're also going to be working on building those super speed teams that I mentioned earlier, the teams that are averaging about a minute or less, and then you're going to be making a much stronger push in arena, probably towards G1 or C3. Again, doesn't mean you'll achieve those levels. Obviously not everybody can, and it is very challenging to do so, and there's going to be an element of luck to go with your skill. So you don't necessarily have to reach G1 to be late mid game. You just have to feel like you're ready to try for G1 in arena. And then your end game players are the ones who are often going to be moving into the highest ranked guild content. Now, not all players do choose to move into this. Some people don't enjoy G3 Siege or G3 Guild War, or just really enjoy the guild they're in or like their guildies or whatever. But this is one of the things you can do in late game. So here's the key to late game. Late game players are people who can do whatever they want to do in the game. They may not choose to do it all, but they can do it all. So they may choose to go into competitive RTA, or they may find RTA too frustrating. They may just do some weird stuff like building 40 cons for World Boss. Once you're in endgame, I would say it's fine if you want to build monsters and get competitive in World Boss, or rune monsters and get competitive in World Boss. I wouldn't do it at any point before endgame, but once you're in endgame, and basically this is what it comes down to, you have the ability to do anything in the game that you want, other than, maybe win the SWC or something, right? They can go for leaderboard rankings, try to get top 100 or top 50 in the different dungeons and stuff like that. These are my definitions for it, and if you're wondering how you should progress through the game in the new Summoner's War post-update with artifacts, with B12s, this is my take, this is my expectation on how somebody should progress. Now, I mentioned this at the start, it may not be 100% linear, it may not be exactly this clean, some of it does depend on luck. There is only one last thing that I want to throw in, which is that this guide was basically talking about free-to-play, or at least people who don't spend very much money on the game. For somebody who is pay-to-play, the progression path might be slightly different. And the single biggest change for pay-to-play is that you can jump over most of early game. Not all of it, you still have to do some stuff, but you can jump over most of it, especially now. You buy a few rune packs, you set yourself up quickly with a B12 team. Even if it's a slow team, that's okay, because the quality of runes that you're farming are so insane that you'll be able to set up all those early game teams super quick just by buying a couple of rune packs, and basically just short circuit your adventure or skip forward in your adventure by, potentially a month or two or more. Now, I've said this before, rune packs have diminishing returns. This was true even before this update. It's even more true now. The later in the game you are, the less likely it is to get a rune out of a pack that's going to actually have enough value that it could be used on one of your top monsters. Ultimately, for most players who are in late mid-game and beyond, and probably even mid-game, rune packs are really just adding depth to your siege box. They're not actually benefiting your account all that much. But in early game, they are like steroids for your monsters. They fast forward your account like crazy. So as you're going through game progression, if you're somebody who is open to spending on the game, and I'm not encouraging you to do so or not to do so, I'm obviously a pay-to-play player. I believe in supporting the developers, but I also believe in the free-to-play culture of accomplishment and saying you are able to do it without spending anything. They both have merits. So whichever culture you belong to, if you do choose to spend on the game, then the best time in the game to buy rune packs is the earliest stages of the game, because they let you accelerate so much. As you move into later stages, you would want to look more at packs that offer value, like the daily coupons or those one-time special deals, things like a Transcendent Scroll. You might also look at immemorial stones if you're not raiding yet, or you're just trying to get into raiding. And then always Devilmon packs. That's the one pack that I always buy, is anything with a Devilmon. Try not to get over invested in summoning. Early game summoning, again, if you're a pay-to-play player, early game summoning can be really valuable in terms of getting twins or some of the other key PvE monsters, but there will come a point where you can't skill up the Nat 5s that you're getting, which means you can't use them. Most of the Nat 4s you're getting probably aren't all that useful, and you're spending all these crystals on summoning instead of farming, which actually is going to leave you at a disadvantage, because realistically the runes matter at least as much and usually more than the monsters. Alright guys, so that is it for today's progression guide. I covered a lot of topics. I know it was a long video, so if you're still hanging out to this point, I want to say I appreciate the support for watching. Please leave a comment down below. Tell me what you think. Tell me if you think there's anything out of place. And otherwise, we'll see you next time. Hey guys, if you're still with me to this point, then that means that you probably liked the video, found it entertaining, or even better, both. So please smash the like button, hit the subscribe button, and leave a comment down below, because those things help the channel grow, and more importantly, they show me that the video is useful, and that's the whole reason I do this in the first place.